Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 40, which now focuses on circulation and the cardiovascular system. So basically this is all about your heart and your blood. Well, if you have a heart, unlike me. Now, the first thing we want to talk about is before we get to us and how our system works, I want to point out that most animals have a circulatory system, but not all of them will. And when you have a circulatory system, the two types of fluids that you'll find are blood, which is in blood vessels, and then you have hemolymph, which is a mixture of blood, but also with tissue fluid. Now, when there's a circulatory system, there are two possible types. There's the open circulatory system, which you see in this figure here. And notice there's a term here, hemocoil, which you'll hear in relation to the open system. And basically in that system, the heart pumps hemolymph via vessels that empty into tissue spaces. And here you see it emptying into the tissue spaces. And you notice that these sides are not connected to each other. You'll notice the open system, which you usually find in arthropods, things like insects and crustaceans, which I call the crunchy, shelly kind of organisms like crabs, and most mollusks as well. That's where you'll find this open system. You'll notice that basically the blood is not enclosed in the blood vessels, but rather it's being pumped into a cavity, so into an open kind of cavity. And as the heart beats in this animal and the animal's moving around, that hemolymph will basically go through all of the different organs within the body cavity. And then it'll re-enter the heart. And notice it's not re-entering the heart the way our blood would, through arteries or blood vessels. Instead, there are these holes in the heart called ostia or ostia, O-S-T-I-A. Okay, so I want you to circle ostia and hemocoil so that you know that both of these are terms you encounter for open circulatory systems. Okay, the alternative to that is organisms that have a closed circulatory system. And in the closed system, the blood is kept in blood vessels and basically circulates through a closed circuit of vessels as the heart pumps. And they'll ultimately lead to capillaries, which are blood vessels involved in the site of gas exchange. And then once the blood has gone around this systemic route, meaning the body system, and all these blood vessels, it then returns to the heart again through other blood vessels, through arteries. So it's closed off. It's never just pooling in any cavity. It is kept in the blood vessels. Now, these two systems are very different from each other. And the point I want to make is that even though we like our nice closed circulatory system, the little guys that do have the open system have the advantage that open circulatory systems use up less energy. Now, if we focus on transport in vertebrates, in the vertebrates, you're always going to find closed circulatory system. And that's what we call our cardiovascular system. Now you notice that we start off here with a nice, strong, muscular heart. And the heart, we like to point out the two main types of chambers that you'll find are atria and ventria. The atria are the chambers that receive blood, meaning whenever blood is entering the heart, whether it's entering from the body system or whether it's entering from the lungs, it always enters into atria. Then the atria pump the blood into the ventricle chambers. And the ventricle chambers are the parts of the heart that will then pump blood into vessels, meaning into veins that are into arteries that are leaving away from the heart. okay? So atria is blood entering the heart. Ventricles is for blood leaving the heart, either leaving to the body systems or leaving to the lungs. And it leaves in the next guy over here, arteries. Okay, arteries, the trick to remember function is circle the A in arteries and tell yourself away. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. There are two places that it can be carrying it away to, either to the rest of the body, to various organs, or to the lungs to pick up some more oxygen. In addition to the big old arteries, you also have arterioles, which are just small arteries that then lead to capillaries. And the capillaries are tiny, yet the big shots of the cardiovascular system, because capillaries function in gas exchange. The capillaries are where any exchange of materials with the tissue fluids will occur. So for instance, when we say that oxygen is entering the blood or leaving the blood, this exchange will occur at capillaries. The last ones to talk about are veins, and your veins are the opposite of what arteries are doing. So if arteries are away, then veins are too, meaning veins carry blood to the heart. Okay, so make sure you're very comfortable with that difference, what each of these structures is doing. And when you see venules, just like arterioles, venules are basically the smaller version of veins, and they're draining blood from the capillaries to give the veins. Okay, so arterioles and venules are always where you're going to have a capillary exchange. Now, when we talk about circulatory systems, not everyone's looks the same. I know people always picture circulatory systems the way that we see our human one, but a lot of different organisms have slightly different versions of their heart and of their circulatory systems. So here we have fish, amphibians, and other vertebrates, and I want you to be familiar with the general idea of each of their circulatory pathways. So first we have fish, and you notice fish, their circulatory system has blood flow in a nice single loop, okay? Only one loop. There's only one atrium and only one ventricle in that single loop. Whereas now amphibians, they have a double loop, two different loops, okay? Blood flows through that double loop, and you'll see two atria now, so a right and a left atrium, but they both go into a single ventricle. This is different from other vertebrates, including us, who have a double loop, and we have a heart divided by a septum. So a septum is a central wall that splits our heart in two, so that we have a left and a right side. And with that, we have four chambers. So there's a right atrium, a left atrium, and then a right ventricle and a left ventricle. And the reason why we have these two separate loops is for our pulmonary circuit and our systemic circuit. Okay? So anytime you see organisms with two loops, just like the amphibians here, you'll notice it's split into pulmonary, meaning for the lungs, and systemic, meaning for the rest of the body, okay? And we'll talk more in a minute about why that's significant. Now, when we talk about the human heart, it's a very muscular organ, thank goodness for that, because it allows it to pump that blood all over your body with a lot of force. And when we talk about how it's muscular, I want to point out that you'll a lot of times see the term cardiomyocytes. And cardiomyocytes is just a fancy way of saying cardiac muscle cells. Now, when you think of this muscular heart, there are three layers to focus on. And you can see them in this figure here. Okay, so there's the endocardium, the myocardium, and the pericardium. And there's a trick to remembering which is which. So endo, whenever you hear endo in biology, you think within. So the endocardium is actually the inner lining of the heart. Then from myocardium, I want you to circle the letter M and write middle. So the myocardium is the middle layer of the heart layers. And then you have the pericardium. Sometimes you hear it as epicardium as well, but the pericardium is your outer sac lining of the heart. Now, in addition to those layers of the heart, something else I want to point out is the septum that we mentioned earlier. So the septum is the wall in the middle of the heart that separates the left and the right sides. Now, when you have the left and the right side, again, that's because you're going to have two different systems that we're going to talk about in a minute. You're going to have the pulmonary system and the systemic system, or the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Now, in the heart, we've already mentioned that you have atria and you have the ventricles. The atria, we said, are the top chambers. This is where blood will enter, whether it's entering from the body or from the lungs. It has to enter atrium first, and then it goes into a ventricle. And the ventricle are the lower chambers that will then pump blood away from the heart. And if it's away from the heart, that tells you the ventricles are pumping into arteries. And I want to point out that, again, with the arteries, you'll have one artery that's leading to the lungs, which we call the pulmonary artery because it's going to the lungs, and then one leading away to the aorta, which is the aorta carries blood to all your body systems. Now, as you see, we keep mentioning there's a left and a right side to the heart. And there's a trick to kind of help you remember which side is doing what, okay? Because you have two places the heart's going to send blood, and you want to remember which side goes where. Well, think about it. The heart needs to give blood to the whole body so that all of the organ tissues can get oxygen, okay? So that's one place that blood is going from the heart. The other one we said is the lungs. Now think about where these things are located, okay? The lungs, they're very close to the heart. The rest of the body, that could be pretty far. So for instance, the rest of the body includes the heart having to send blood all the way down to your tippy toes. That's a far distance. That means you're going to have to pump that blood harder. So the trick to remember which side is which. If you've ever paid attention with TV or even heard people speak, where do people always think that the heart is located? They always say the left side of the chest, right? That's not actually where the heart is located. Your heart is actually located in the center of your chest at a slight angle. But the reason why so many people think that your heart is on your left side of your chest is because you notice such a forceful pump there. Even if you put your hand on your chest, you'll always notice the left side, you really feel that heart pumping. So if you think of all these people on TV that always say the heart's on the left side, well, that's because you have a more forceful pump that you're feeling. So where do you think the left side of your heart is pumping blood? To your whole body, right? Out the aorta and to your whole body, including your tippy little toes. Whereas the right side of the heart, you don't feel that as much because that doesn't have to pump as far, right? Well, the right side of the heart is just pumping to your lungs. So to your pulmonary artery and your lungs to pick up oxygen. Okay, so if you kind of remind yourself that whole concept of left being more powerful, so where do you think it's going? Much further to your tippy toes. That'll help remind you which artery each ventricle is leading to and which part of your body that blood is going. Now, in addition to all those structures, there are also valves, vena cava, that I want you to know, okay? So when you think of the four valves of the heart, basically you will have a valve that will direct movement of blood and prevent blood from moving backwards where it came from. So you'll always have a valve between chambers and where blood is leaving a location, okay? So you'll have valves between the right atria and the right ventricle, as well as the left atria and the left ventricle. Those are your atrioventricular valves. So if you look in the pictures, valves located between atria and ventricles, which is right here, this valve here, and right here, those are your AV valves. And the names that you see them listed as is tricuspid and mitral. So over here, your tricuspid and your mitral, okay? Tricuspid valve is between the right atria and the right ventricle, and mitral is between the left atria and the left ventricle. And it prevents the blood from swishing back into the atria after the atria has pushed the blood into the ventricle. You then have valves protecting the blood from swishing back into the ventricle after the ventricles have pushed it out into the arteries. And these are the semilunar valves, which are going between the arteries and the ventricle. And the semilunar, you'll have the pulmonary and the aortic, okay? And we already mentioned that your pulmonary, anything pulmonary in the heart, is for the right side, whereas the left will have the aortic because that's going to the body, to the aorta. You also have vena cava and arteries. So vena cava, those are veins, which means they are entering the heart, and you'll see two of them. So you'll see the superior vena cava and the inferior, which is the bottom one, the lower one, because superior is always at the top, and anyone or anything inferior means lower level. So superior, you notice that one is entering the heart from the upper extremities. Okay, top extremities, which think of, coming in from the brain or the arms, whereas inferior is coming from the bottom, from lower, because inferior, like I said, lower. These lower extremities would be things like your lower organs and your legs. Then you have the two arteries that I want you to know, and we've already mentioned them. You have the aorta and the pulmonary artery. And both arteries are always away from the heart, so they're carrying blood away from the heart. The pulmonary, like it says, is going to the lungs, which means that oxygen wants to go pick up, that blood wants to go pick up oxygen. And the aorta is to send the oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body. Okay, so keep in mind, kind of go over this a few times, practice where blood is moving and what each of the terms of the heart actually means. Here you have a more detailed internal view of the heart, just to kind of show you in a little prettier detail or a little more realistic detail what these valves actually look like and what the lining of that muscular heart looks like. And again, notice the left side is a lot thicker because it's got to pump that blood a lot further, okay? And something else that I also want to point out to you is the fact that there are gap junctions as part of this heart. And that's a term that you've seen before. So you're all pros on what gap junctions were for, right? They were for exchange, okay? They have, if you look here, it's as if you're seeing nice little straws to send things through. Gap junctions are for exchange, so they're involved in exchanging the electrical currents and ions through the heart's pumping. Now, this slide is basically going to be a bit of review because we've kind of already covered the main concept of where blood has to go with regard to the heart and the rest of the body. So first you have blood returning to the heart from the systemic circuit, and that means from the body circuit. So this blood has just finished giving oxygen to all of the organs in your body, all the way down to your tippy toes, And that means that it gave away its oxygen. So think about it. If it's returning and it gave away its oxygen, what's it going to want to do? It's going to want to pick up more oxygen, right? Where do you pick up oxygen in the body? You pick it up in the lungs, right? So what happens with this blood? It returns to the heart and it enters the right atrium, okay? Because again, remember the right side, that weaker side goes to the lungs. The blood enters the right atrium. The right atrium will then pump that blood through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. And then where does it leave after a ventricle? It gets pumped into the pulmonary artery, right? It pumps through the pulmonary valve to make it to the pulmonary artery and to go into the lungs. Then you have the blood that returns from the lungs, from the pulmonary circuit. So if you think about it, what happened to this blood? Well, it got oxygen, right? It's been oxygenated. So that's going to enter the left atrium and get pumped in through the mitral valve to the left ventricle. And what does the left ventricle want to do? Well, it got all of this oxygenated blood. It's going to want to share it with the rest of the body. Okay, it wants to go bring oxygen to the rest of the body. So the left ventricle will now pump the blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, which leads to the systemic circuit, meaning the body system. Okay, now throughout this process, keep in mind, oxygen-poor blood never mixes with the oxygen-rich blood. And that is why it's so important that we have the 4-chamber heart. Remember I said that that would come back, and here it is coming back to you. Okay, so please practice the parts of the heart and where the blood is flowing and why it's flowing there. If you want some additional practice or a little more clarification, then please send me a message and remind. Now with this process, you get the heart beating as it's pumping that blood to the lungs and pumping that blood to the rest of your body. You have in this heartbeat what's called systole and diastole. For systole, I want you to circle that S and think squeeze, right? Systole is the contraction of the heart chambers when it's pumping that blood. Whereas diastole, think of die, relax, right? All that relaxation. Relaxation of the heart chambers is diastole, okay? So systole is squeezing contractions, and diastole is when it relaxes to fill with blood. So the pulse then is this 2-part pumping action. It basically takes about a second to have diastole and to have systole, and it takes into account both of those. Now with this, you get the rhythmic contraction of the heart, that rhythmic pumping and that rhythmic lub-dub that you basically hear. So the rhythmic contraction of the heart is due to what's called the cardiac conduction system. And that's based on the SA node, okay? Not writing an essay, it stands for sinoatrial. And that's in the wall of the right atria. And because that initiates the heartbeat, that's what's called the cardiac pacemaker, because it's setting the pace for that heartbeat. Okay? It's setting the electrical signal for the heartbeat. And you can actually record the electrical changes and any anomalies or any problems in the heartbeat during that cardiac cycle through using an EKG or an ECG, which stands for electrocardiogram. Now, with the cardiac cycle, you constantly have that systole followed by diastole, and doctors will basically listen for the lub-dub sounds, with lub being the closing of the valves that lead to the ventricles, and dub being the closing of the valves that lead to the arteries. Okay, so when you're listening for that lub-dub sound, you're basically listening for the beginning of systole the beginning of that pumping. And then the dub, not dubstep, the dub is the beginning of diastole. Okay, so that alternation between squeeze and relax, squeeze and relax. And that is your heartbeat. Now this is here just to summarize the stages that we've just talked about. So here they did a beautiful visualization of what cardiac diastole actually means. And remember, die, like you're dying, just relax. That cardiac diastole, basically because it's a relaxed state, is when you're filling the heart with blood, very zen, fill with blood. And then, boom, all of a sudden you want systole, right? You want to pump that blood, get it into the ventricles, with the ventricles in diastole, because you want to fill them with blood. Okay, take all the blood that entered the heart and push it into the ventricles. And then what do you want the ventricles to do? You want them to squeeze, ventricular systole. You want them to squeeze those ventricles, push that blood out and to the body and to the lungs as well. Okay, so you alternate between diastole and systole depending on whether you want blood pooling and entering a certain location or blood being squeezed and pushed out of that location. Now, like I mentioned, you can have this tracking of the heart, how it's working in terms of the electrical pulses via an ECG or an EKG. And if you take A&P or A&P2, funny enough, one of my brothers teaches A&P here as well, in case you end up getting him for that class. With the EKG or the ECG, it's basically just tracking the electrical impulses. And where did we say that the electrical impulse of the heartbeat starts? In the SA node, the sinoatrial node in that right atria of the heart. So I want you to circle the sinoatrial node and write cardiac pacemaker. This is where the electrical impulse starts and then travels to the AV node. And then you have the bundle branches carrying that electrical impulse to then spread all throughout the ventricle walls to contract and push the blood out of the heart. Okay, and the EKG or the ECG is basically going to see if that's functioning the way that it should, or if your heart rate and the electrical impulses are out of whack. Now this slide is just a summary to again repeat in your head and remind you that there are two different circuits for that blood. One is the pulmonary circuit. The purpose of that is to get oxygen from the lungs into the blood. And then the other circuit is the systemic circuit, to then have that blood travel through all of your body parts to get to all of the organs and give them the oxygen. Now this is just a visual to help show you when we say systemic, we mean a whole lot of systems. So you can see that there was the upper or the superior systems, including your head and your arms. And then you have the lower inferior systems, body parts such as your liver, digestive tract, kidneys, and even all the way down to your legs. Now, when we talk about blood movement, an important thing to consider is your blood pressure. Okay, and when we talk about blood pressure, that's basically the pressure that blood is going to be pushing through your blood vessels as your heart and your body tries to get that blood to all of your different organs. And your blood pressure, we measure systolic over diastolic blood pressure. So again, systolic is, think of contraction. So that's the very active, heart is beating kind of pressure. The optimal systolic pressure is 120. so 120 mmHg. The diastolic, which is the lower number, the denominator that we do, diastolic blood pressure is between heartbeats. And the optimal diastolic pressure is around 80 mmHg. And they're kind of slightly lowering those numbers a little bit lately, but your goal is around 120 over 80 for blood pressure. Now keep in mind, your blood pressure is constantly changing. There's a lot of factors that can make your blood pressure change within a second, okay? Things like temperature, hormones, stress, doing exercise, even things like hydration. Did you drink enough water? Did you have electrolytes? Eating, the kind of meals you eat. How much did you eat? How fast did you eat it? Did it have a lot of sugar? Did it have a lot of salt? Okay, even things like sitting down versus standing versus laying down can all affect your blood pressure. So don't freak out if they ever take your blood pressure and it's suddenly not, ideal, okay? Never trust a single reading of blood pressure. Instead, go based on having a few readings. And I always recommend, since it has been recommended to me as well, to have a machine that reads your blood pressure, okay? A sphygmomanometer is one such type of machine, so you can measure your blood pressure with that. And again, you're measuring systolic over diastolic, okay? Now, ultimately, with that blood flow and that pressure, I just want to spend a second going over one of the examples I gave you, because people usually think of things like stress and exercise affecting their blood pressure, but they don't think of temperature. And so I just want to point out that with temperature, we keep mentioning vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And so vasoconstriction, like when it's cold, we went over that, how the veins constrict. Think about that. They're constricting the veins, and so that's increasing the force of blood, the pressure moving through those veins. It's like I said in another lesson, when you squeeze on toothpaste and it shoots out. So that's what I mean by temperature affecting your blood pressure, whereas vasodilation is something that will have the blood pressure plummet and drop. So anything causing vasodilation will lead to lower blood pressure. And this chart is just to give you an idea of when blood pressure starts to be categorized as hypertension. And that could be very dangerous for you in the long run. So make sure to pay attention to your blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, then avoid certain foods and try to have a low salt diet. Now, the reason why paying attention to your blood pressure is important, because cardiovascular diseases tend to be one of the big #1 killers around nowadays. So you want to reduce your risk of having any cardiovascular diseases by paying attention to your diet, eating proper nutrition, avoiding too many saturated fats and trans fats, trying to maintain a good, low, stable weight, and not smoking. And not smoking includes not vaping, not using marijuana. Any kind of smoking can increase your cardiovascular disease and cause respiratory complications. Okay? Now, some of the cardiovascular diseases that are very common are hypertension, which we just mentioned. That means high blood pressure. Again, the normal blood pressure is 120 over 80. So when you start creeping further and further above that, you end up with hypertension. Another one that we've mentioned already as well is atherosclerosis, and that you can sometimes hear as hardening of the arteries. Basically what happens, like pictured in this figure, is you get cholesterol and fatty materials called plaques that clump up and build up on the arteries. And these fatty deposits, by clumping up and sticking to the arteries, they're now narrowing the amount of open artery, which means they're narrowing the amount of blood that can be carried, which narrows or decreases the amount of oxygen that can be carried. So you're getting less and less oxygen throughout your body and to your other body tissues because of all of these fatty deposits on your arteries and your blood vessels. The other complication or problem with these kinds of plaques is that the plaques can cause a clot that dislodges from the artery, and as that travels through your body, it can easily get lodged where it should not be. And you could end up with a stroke or a heart attack. A stroke is when you end up having an arteriole, so those little arteries that are for transferring blood through the capillaries. If that bursts or gets blocked by one of those clots, you end up with a stroke, and that is specifically in the brain. Okay, so a stroke is when you have an arterial burst or blocked clot in the brain. And if instead you have an artery in the heart, a coronary artery, that becomes blocked or bursts, that is a heart attack. Okay, so these plaques and cholesterol deposits can be very problematic in your body, and it's very dangerous when they then try to clear them out. Now, all this time we've been talking about the circulatory system. We keep mentioning blood, but what exactly is blood? Well, there are two main portions for you to be aware of. Blood is made up of plasma, which is the liquid flowing part, and then the cells and platelets, which are the important element parts. And make sure you're comfortable with knowing what each of those types of cells and platelets do. Okay, so the red blood cells, that's for oxygen transport. Your white blood cells are for protection. They're part of your immune system. And your platelets help clot the blood, okay? Because blood clotting in small amounts is important, which we'll see on the next slide, but you don't want major clotting in your body. We've also used that figure here to help you visualize various functions of the plasma and of the different parts of the blood. When you think of the homeostatic functions of blood, some of the stuff we've already mentioned. It's involved in transport of substances, especially transport of oxygen for exchange with tissues, so giving oxygen to all your tissues. Your blood also functions to guard against pathogens because, like we said, it includes those white blood cells that are your immune system. So it guards against pathogens. Your blood also is involved in regulating your body temperature and even buffering your body pH as well. And in addition, it maintains osmotic pressure, meaning your salt content, and is involved in clotting to prevent if you ever get cuts or whatnot. Clotting helps you from losing major amounts of fluid. Now that brings us to the next slide, which emphasizes the benefits of clotting, because like I said before, we do usually think of clotting as a bad thing, but it's actually an important thing that platelets in your blood do for you, because when you get a cut, the platelets help seal up that cut and gather fibrin threads to form to prevent you from having blood start pouring out of that opening. Okay, so platelets and clotting is to help prevent you from losing too much blood. Now, the other thing I want to mention in terms of blood, we keep focusing and emphasizing how important blood is for exchanging gases and nutrients in terms of your body and with your various organs. That is done thanks to capillaries, and capillaries are very narrow. They're usually just a single cell thick. And there's basically two forces controlling this movement with capillaries. The first one is osmotic pressure, which you already know. Osmosis means the movement of water from their tissue fluid to the blood, in this case. And then your blood pressure, which is the opposite movement of that water. Now, the wall of the capillaries are very thin, which is important for the diffusion of the nutrients, gases, and wastes. And basically, I want you to think, now think of arteries versus veins. And arteries, like we keep saying, is away from the heart. So think about what would you want to bring to the rest of the body. So capillaries moving through with the arteries or exchanging with the arteries, arteries want to bring oxygen to the rest of the body, right? So oxygen and nutrients exit a capillary near the arterial end because that's for the rest of the body. Then veins coming back to the heart to be purified and replenished, what are they going to want to do? Well, carbon dioxide and waste molecules enter a capillary near the venous side, near the veins, because veins will give you the carbon dioxide and wastes because they have to go back to the heart to be purified, whereas the artery side will be for oxygen and nutrients. Okay, so everything keeps coming back in repetition with this concept. Now, the last point I want to make is about blood types. And your blood types are determined by the presence or absence of what are called antigens or agglutinogens. Okay? These can be A, B, or a special additional factor called the Rh factor. You also have antibodies in your blood, which are called agglutinins. Now, what's important in terms of this concept? There can be a lot of cross reactions and problems in terms of blood typing. Okay? If antigens meet antibodies, what happens when antigens meet antibodies? They agglutinate. Okay, that's why you keep saying that term, agglutinogens, agglutinins, because when these come together, they agglutinate, meaning they clump together. You do not want clumping together in your blood. Now, luckily, antibodies and antigens are very specific. So antigens, the way you can think about the concept of blood typing, antigens are like your name tag. You are named after whatever antigen you have on your blood cells. So that means if you have A-type blood, then that means each of your blood cells all have the A name tag, meaning the A antigen. So what I want you to do is circle the word antigen over here and write name tag. Okay, so if you're A-type blood, you have the A name tag on all of your cells. If you are B-type blood, then you have the B antigen name tag on all of your blood. If you are AB blood, you are named AB because your name tags have A and B antigens. And then for O, you can write big fat 0. There is no name tag. Okay? He is basically in a ninja stealth suit. He's got no name. He's trying to hide. Okay? That's O blood. So what this means for your body, that means that your body is going to be chill and cool anytime it encounters a name tag that it recognizes. So for instance, if you're A blood and your body encounters any cell that says A, that's going to be like, okay, that's cool. That's me. That's myself. I'm not going to attack. It's not an intruder. If it sees a name tag that is not you, so for instance, you're A, and it suddenly sees a name tag, meaning an antigen that says B, it's going to flip out. It's going to say, attack. It's an intruder. And the way it attacks that intruder is by using your antibodies against that intruder. Okay? So you will only have antibodies in your body that are anti-invaders. Meaning you will not have antibodies for your own name tags because then your blood would be clumping all the time. You only have antibodies for intruders. So in that example of A blood, my name is A because my antigen name tag says A. If I encounter any cells that say B, I'm going to attack them with my anti-B antibodies. Okay? I do not have any anti-A antibodies because then I would constantly be clumping and die. Okay, so you're only anti the intruders. So then notice B blood. My name is B, my name tag antigens are B, and I will attack anything that is A. That's why the antibodies are anti-A. And you can circle antibody here and write anti-invaders to remind you that the antibodies will be anti-invaders, anything that is not you. So then you have AB blood here. Well, that means all of my cells, my blood cells, would have A and B name tags. So I wouldn't see anything as an invader, right? Because if I see A, well, I recognize that. I have some A. B looks familiar to me also. So there's no antibodies. Okay, I won't attack anything. And that's why AB is the universal recipient. It could take any blood because it's not going to attack it. It does not have any antibodies against it. So next to AB, I want you to write universal recipient. It could take any blood without attacking it, without clumping. The last option is O blood. We said O is the ninja. He doesn't have any name tags, any antigens. What does that mean? He doesn't have any name tags or any antigens. He will attack anything else. Anything that does not match O. Okay, he will attack A blood because he doesn't recognize that. He doesn't have any name tags that are A. He'll attack B blood because I don't have any B name tags. That's an invader. And he'll attack AB because that's also considered an invader. So because they have, O blood has no antigens, that means it views anything else as an invader. And that's why O is only the universal donor. Okay, because you could give O blood to someone and it won't have any antigen, any name tags for their body to be upset about. But it can't receive from anyone other than O, because anyone else will trigger the O blood's antibodies to go crazy. Okay? So whenever you're doing this kind of problem, ask yourself, what would it view as an invader? So I'm going to give you an example now that I want you to send me the answer to in Remind. Okay? Which of the following would be a problem? Giving B blood to someone who's type AB, or giving B blood to someone who is type O. Okay, so which of those two scenarios would be a problem? Giving B blood to someone who is type AB, or giving B blood to someone who is type O? Send me your response and Remind with a brief explanation as to why, what will happen in each of those scenarios. Okay, if you're having any trouble with this, again, ask me and Remind. I'll give you some more practice problems. I'll give you exactly how it could be written as a multiple choice, and we can go over the different scenarios again. Okay? And that brings us to the end of the cardiovascular chapter. So if you have any questions or any concerns, or if you just like some practice problems or to review certain concepts, as always, send me any kind of message in the Remind app, day or night. Like I say, I have no life, so more than happy to help. Again, at the end of every chapter, please make sure you're adding this material to your study guide that you then will upload into Blackboard, and make sure to be jotting down any of the multiple choice questions you come up with that you will then include in your discussion board post. Thank you and have a wonderful day.